with a mission of centering artists in the invention and design of our shared future. The 2020 resident artists gathered here tonight and tomorrow evening represent that mission fully. Sofía Córdova, Betsam Saad, Pelenakeke Brown, and Elissa Blount Moorehead each work in unique ways to further our imagination of not only what is in the present, but what also can be, extending the horizon of possibility by creating space for imagination. So it's my pleasure to welcome you. We're glad you're here for tonight's conversation. And now I will turn it over to Jay, our Manager of Programs and Inclusion. Thanks, Jay.
Hi. Thanks, Roddy. It's great to be here with all of you. I am, as Roddy said, I'm the Manager of Programs and Inclusion here at Eyebeam. We're very happy that you're here with us tonight, celebrating our 2020 residents, Sofía Córdova, Betsam Saad, Pelenakeke Brown, Elissa Blount Moorehead. And before we begin, I'd also like to describe myself for those that might be blind or low vision. I have light brown skin, shortish, curly brown hair. It's been growing a lot lately. Brown eyes. I'm wearing a very bright button-down shirt that is blue, yellow, red, and green print. I'd also like to start with an access check and just kind of orient everyone to the virtual room here. There are a number of Eyebeam staff members that are supporting tonight's event. So please feel free to reach out to them in the chat box. That'll be your best area for getting information. And if you need anything, feel free to chat us directly, or if you're having any technical difficulties. Edan is here to assist with any access needs or questions that you may have. Tonight's gathering is also being captioned. Hello to Lisa from LC Interpreting Services, who is our captioner tonight. We also have ASL with Candace and Grayson, also from LC. Welcome. Maddie will be posting directions in the chat box on how to make captions visible if they aren't already, as well as other helpful information. Maddie is also our social media person tonight. I'm your virtual door person. Please note we're keeping an eye out for Zoom crashers or trolls. Should anyone co-opt the meeting or use derogatory language, they will be kicked out. Because we have a large group of participants tonight, we ask that during the Q&A that all questions are asked in the chat box. A member of the team will then share it with the artists, and the artists will then respond. We're also recording this gathering for archival access and sharing purposes. If you wish to not be recorded, we recommend turning off your video. Please let us know at any time if you have any other access needs or how else we can facilitate. This conversation, as Roddy mentioned, is one of two taking place over 2 days, where we ask the residents to invite a guest of their choice to be in a 30-minute conversation with them, to reflect on their process, to reflect on place, on family, and the quickly shifting uses of digital media. Tonight, we'll be hearing from Sofía Córdova and their guest, Carmen Winant, and then following that, Betsam Saad with artist Zach Blas. Each night, we'll hear from each pair, and then we'll regroup for a Q&A with all 4 speakers. Tomorrow, we'll be hearing from Eyebeam resident Pelenakeke Brown, who's also on the call with us today, and her guest artist, Jeff Casper, and then resident Elissa Blount Moorehead, also here tonight, with writer Tina Campt. Join us then at 5 p.m. at the same time, using the same Zoom link if you're available. If not, I hope that you're out there and you're taking part in supporting the celebration and supporting Black Lives Matter movement in the US and abroad, where you can. I'd also like to go ahead and introduce Sofía Córdova. She is a Puerto Rican-born, Oakland-based conceptual interdisciplinary artist who works with performance, music, video, photography, sculpture, and installation. Her work, which has been exhibited and collected by art institutions such as SF MoMA and the Whitney, considers sci-fi and futurity, dance and music cultures, the internet, mystical objects, extinction and mutation, migration, marginality, and climate change under the conditions of late capitalism and its technologies. Sofia's guest, Carmen Winant, is the Roy Lichtenstein Endowed Chair of Studio Art at The Ohio State University and a 2019 Guggenheim Fellow in Photography. Winant collects and alloys found photographs as methods of looking closely at feminist modes of survival, revolt, and innermost feeling. She lives in Columbus, Ohio, with her partner, Luke Stettner, and her 2- and 4-year-old sons, Rafa and Carlo. At the transition, I'll introduce the next guest. And with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Sofia and Carmen. It's great to gather with you all. Welcome.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the introduction, Jay and Roddy and Carmen. Thank you so much for joining me and all of these folks across the universe. Quickly wanted to do a description of myself. I am an Afro-Indigenous woman from the Caribbean, Puerto Rico. I have short hair, short curly hair because of a recent COVID-induced haircut. And I'm sitting in a dense little library here under a very hot skylight in California.
Should I go ahead at this point, Sofia?
Yes.
Okay. Hello, everyone in the universe, as Sofia says out there. It's such a pleasure and a privilege to be asked into this conversation, not only to speak with Sofia, whom I've known and loved for so long, but really to be a part of this larger community, even in this small and indirect way. I am thinking about the best way to describe myself. I'm a 36-year-old Jewish woman. I have dark hair that I have slicked back. I have also given myself a few too many COVID haircuts. I do not have glasses, and I'm wearing a long black dress. With that, so should we jump in, Sofia? Unless there are other introductions that need be had.
No, let's jump in. I think what I'll do is we can get the ball rolling, and then I'll share screen as we're talking and just have some slides kind of ambiently playing, so it's not just our faces, our mugs.
Great. So then maybe I can jump in. I mentioned that I've known Sofia for a long time. Sofia and I met at graduate school in 2008 at CCA. I see Julia out there. Hi, Julia was also there, which was a really meaningful and fraught time, I think, in both of our lives. And we spent dedicated hours, cumulative days and weeks in each other's studios, in addition to sort of mutual coursework, just trying to figure it out together. And our paths have sort of continued, we've kind of clung to each other in the best sense, as our paths have sort of continued to remain parallel as we have moved into being artists in the world, writers in some cases, mothers, and so I feel very close to Sofia and to the work, which I admire greatly. And Jay already has listed a few of the, let's say, variables, kind of a few of the channels in the work, but I thought that I too would start with a kind of a list, some of which overlaps with what Jay mentioned and some of which I've invented. Qualities that I see in Sofia's work: pop, climate change, mystical mechanisms, dystopia meets optimism, colonialism and imperialism, late capitalism and accelerationism, survival, the sacred and unholy, regeneration, botanical environments, redemption, sculpture or something like taxidermy, psychedelia, the imaginable and the unimaginable, marginality, violence, and of course, liberation. And I wanted to start with that list because there are, by design, so many places to enter into Sofia's work. And that is the strength and the power of the work in so many ways. It's sort of its multiplicity and its intersecting avenues, and sort of profuse, all the entanglements, the profuse entanglements. And so we spoke before this and thinking about sort of what the frame could be for this conversation. So I want to start with that point that that there's so many ways into this work, and for the purposes of time, we're going to be sort of narrowing down a bit to talk about and sort of collectively think about, particularly as we move into the Q&A, about the future, which, as I wrote to Sofia, is where your work lives. And of course, in so many ways, I would argue, is where the world is looking now. And for you, Sofia, and I'm finally going to sort of build up to my first question, I think of the future as like not just like a metaphor, a kind of out there, but an actual space to be occupied, like a physical space to be designed and built out and lived inside of. And I guess we could start there. How do you think about the future in your work as a place to live and not just to sort of make symbol of? Or maybe a little bit of both.
I think, yeah, I think that's a really important sort of distinction to make. And I'm glad to have that as the jump off point, because I will say, before I even get into the weeds of the work, so much of my practice since becoming sort of a performance artist at the heart of it has been imbued with this feeling that I'm performing myself doing the work. So in a sense, traveling to the future, like seriously occupying that space, feels akin to the practice, and it feels like an actual event that I can sort of tap into, that I can sort of put myself in that place, because I'm already working within this framework of constantly performing, in a sense. The future is a free and open space, right? Like that's the sort of immediate offering that it provides me, as well as the work. But I think it's also really important because it lets me, and I say this as someone who can be painfully cynical, but it lets me really feel and believe that a different world is possible. And I want to say that that isn't always the way that my narratives perform in that space, but from like the strictly process speaking place, I feel that the future, beyond the sort of obvious possibilities in its sort of non-existence, really does feel like an inhabitable space where I don't feel bogged down by all of the systems that are currently, stepping on my neck. I'm gonna share screen just so we can have a little ambiance. That's not the right word for this all, but and then someone, oh, sorry. Okay, just want to make sure that it's.
And the way that we decided to do this is that Sofia will sort of cycle through the images, and we'll stop and talk about images as they sort of attend to the ideas that we're talking about. But that we wanted to sort of have a conversation about practice building and the connective tissue between the works. Sofia, I don't see images.
Yeah, exactly. So no need. I know it's saying my internet connection's unstable, which is really cool to be happening right now.
We can always keep talking. I mean, images or no images.
Yeah, and it might be maybe one of the Eyebeam folks can share.
Yeah, I can do that. Yeah, I can share your slides.
If you don't mind, just set the images to like just play on their own and like swap every 10 seconds or so, and that will work.
You got it.
Thank you. I worry that I'm killing my computer because I'm under this really hot skyline.
It's okay.
So, Sofia, I'm going to keep it rolling while Jay does that.
Awesome.
Of course, the future is also a place where despair lives. And that's not something that you underestimate or shy away from in the work. I mean, can you talk a bit about like the sort of counter positions of possibility, imagination, hope, openness, freedom, and despair? Like how did those conjoin in the making of your work?
Yeah, I think that's also a really kind of important artifact of the work. The realm of contradiction, the realm of opposing forces kind of running at each other. And I will say that when I started placing my work within a speculative framework. I did so with a kind of one-dimensional hope, where my aim was not to picture or consider apocalypse or dystopia in and of themselves, but to consider what life was like on the other side, particularly for queer, colored, marginalized bodies in any capacity, right? Like, what does our liberation look like, even if the event that led us there is catastrophic? But, and this is important, as I've existed with that work, it felt to me that just encasing it in hope gave me a hierarchical position as narrator that was problematic and antithetical to the aims of the work. The work wants to express a plurality of possibilities, a plurality of coexisting universes. And also, when you're living with the future, it's not always rosy. So I think ambivalence has come to play an incredibly important part of how I think about the work and how I make the work. And so, at the risk of at times, I think, making work that can be frustrating, I'm not interested anymore in making a work that is exclusively about one single possibility of liberation, because I think that that closes many avenues for how we might break free. And so creating a work that in itself is always kind of tripping over itself and stuttering and like falling off the edge creates the possibility and the conditions for, in an ideal situation where somebody connects with it, then they might say, well, that's sort of a flawed view of the future, but that's maybe how all futures will be. There will be flaws in not just the future itself, but in our collective world building. Because the process of revolution is messy. The process of liberation is messy and takes the entirety of the sort of the people, the body that I'm trying to build to collectively make that. And so imbuing the work with a sense of uncertainty is really important.
Mm.
Hey, Sofia, one quick thing. I think your audio is a little spotty. So if you turn off your camera.
I'm gonna.
Yeah, it might be the headphones. Maybe try without. That's a good idea.
Yeah, I took the headphones.
And if that doesn't work, like Jay is saying, you could turn off the camera.
Oh, okay. I'll just maybe just do that. Okay.
Okay. I'm also getting some weird audio crunchiness, so I'll also turn off my camera if I need to. I was struck by something you said. Maybe this is just a small thing, and maybe it's an obvious thing, but you described yourself as a performance artist. And of course, when we met as photographers. Now, neither of us really make pictures anymore.
Yeah.
But I mean, I always thought of you as a brave photographer. But I guess I still thought of you as a photographer in some ways. And I guess I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about positioning yourself inside of performance and like more fundamentally about, if I can put you on the spot in this way, like about bravery, because I see a kind of correlation between what it is to put your body, like in a place of vulnerability, right? Like on stage singing. I remember the first time I went to hear you sing, and also like making work that contends with not just vulnerable bodies, but bodies too, who are being called upon to be brave. Like, how do you see the performative quality of your work, that which you do, as a kind of alloy to the subject matter? Does that make sense?
Yeah. And it took, listen, I think the first act of bravery in a way was that of being able to call myself a performance artist. I think I resisted the term for a really long time. Like the entirety of the time we were in school together, I felt on one end that I didn't have kind of the historical backing to throw my name in that hat, because I was still thinking in a very kind of modernist way about art making. And I was thinking of myself as someone who was a photographer. And so I had to be of one medium. And so once the possibilities of expanding beyond that were open to me, it became really scary, but also liberating in a lot of ways. But performance also always felt like a moniker I didn't want to inhabit, because I also felt that in a sense it had a lot of potential to alienate an audience, because I feel like there's a very specific language that is recalled when we think of performance art. And I often feel like the folks in the world that don't have immediate access to museums or art institutions, etc., feel, and I'm saying this as someone who felt this way for a really long time, just feel really alienated by performance specifically, because it's so rooted in the body, and it's because it's so rooted in a person, really, like in successful cases, stripping it all away. And so I think the first sort of act of bravery was for me to kind of accept that name. I also will say that it kind of depends on the day. On a different day, I might call myself something else, like a filmmaker or something. But I do feel that it has, as much as our auto-identification within the art world can be political, I think it has become political for me, because it is, for me, I feel the most alive, and the message sort of most sort of alive in me when I am in performance. And even if that performance is mediated by a camera and a screen, I still sort of, it's, as you say, it's the most vulnerable, it's the most terrifying. And I work with a lot of other performers, and that sort of third act in the kind of becoming a performance artist moment was really the point where I had to stop hemming and hawing, because I'm asking other people to be really brave and do really strange things for me, and go to weird places with me, and go to traumatic places with me, go to painful places, go to places of ecstasy, all of this. And I couldn't require that of anyone without myself kind of walking in the fire first. And that's sort of how I came to it. But, you know, as always happens, the farther we kind of get away from the inception or the genesis of something, kind of the closer we come back to it eventually. And I do feel like my practice is really deeply indebted to photography. I mean, the way I even make moving imagery still feels really kind of slow and photographic to me. And I do feel like so much of my early training in sort of particularly politics of representation around feminism and around bodies of color, Black bodies, brown bodies, all of that is so important to how I make work. And I think that my early education and all that came in photography.
I wonder too, I'm sorry, Sofia, I'm like veering off course, because we sent some questions back and forth, and
That's fine,
I could have predicted this. Like, I just want to now ask you a bunch of other questions that aren't on our list. So you can take a pass if you know, if I'm putting you on the spot. But the other thing that occurs to me, particularly looking at these images now together, is the way in which you use language. And I'm thinking back to 2008 and like the photos on your studio wall that usually were attended with some language. Like,
I don't think he's got the chance to like really see how far he can crawl before, so I'm just letting him go for it.
What is that?
Just making sure.
Hang on, that's really funny, everyone. That's my partner who's out for a walk and not muted. I am so sorry.
So I thought that was like someone crashing us from the outside.
I know.
Just baby life. So yeah, can you talk about language? I mean, I've never heard you describe it as poetry in this context, what you might want to call it out of context. As I see, you know, like the sort of the subtitles flashing across the screen, as I think about going to the early performances and seeing like the language, actually the lyrics projected on the wall behind you. And I guess I'm curious about like how that too functions in sort of in tandem with the quality of performance and bravery, like how you think about the subtleties of language and writing.
I think maybe poetry is like the next thing that I'm scared of after performance artists. I have such respect and admiration for poets. I feel like they have it figured out in a way that I haven't quite achieved, but I do, text is really important to me. And I think that early days in the work where you see some of the earlier slides, a lot of the text is sort of, I almost feel like it's a call and response with text that I'm reading. So I will borrow a line that sort of resonates with me, throw it in the work, and then respond to it myself or have a character respond to it. But as we've moved on, and the sort of there's a blurriness that I think starts to come around performance as focus, or poetry as focus, or film as focus, and these things kind of collide. The subtitling has become a way to make poetry in a way that's still kind of riding on the coattails, if you will, of the expectation of what a subtitle is there to do. So for example, the image that's up right now, for this piece, I have interviews with my family, and that's what's in yellow. They're speaking in Spanish, and white are song lyrics that I called from my abuelos collection for this piece, specifically about storms. And there are times when deliberately I'm trying to create the atmosphere of a storm is coming or a storm is passing, signals are getting crossed. And so the lyric content and the the interview content collide. And so sometimes I prioritize one sound over the other, and similarly, sometimes I prioritize one subtitle over the other, because I'm still really interested in playing with the possibilities of language as a decolonial tool, in a sense, right? So if these are interviews that are happening in Spanish, particularly Puerto Rican Spanish, which those of you know is very fast, if you're sitting in front of this and you are fluent in Spanish, then like the meaning and the understanding is clearer. But for some members of the audience, and I'm sort of targeting specifically a very specific kind of white gallery goer that might only speak English, then I've always kind of played with making access like the moving target with that audience. That said, I have also become kind of aware of my own failings in creating access for folks that can't hear. And so putting subtitling has also opened up this new dimension of communication that is outside of audio. I do tend to prioritize audio because I work with music so much, but I'm trying to be better about prioritizing people that don't have that as a way into the work, because I really am in that wants to be layered in the sense that certain layers are legible to certain people. And the more access I create, the more those layers can be understood, I think.
How are we doing for time? I have more questions, but I don't want to hog.
You're doing well. We got started a little bit late, so I would say 8 to 10 more minutes.
Oh, okay, great.
Yeah.
Yep, that's what I have on my timer also.
That's, some people have timers. What a good idea that would be. So Sofia, it occurs to me too. I don't know if this is something we've ever talked about, but you left Puerto Rico as a young person, right? I mean, how old were you when you left?
I was 15.
15. And if I'm right about this, right, you didn't encounter English, right? Or learn English until you were about 12, is that right?
Yeah, a little bit before that, but yeah.
I wonder about, this is conjecture. Again, not on our list and pre-approved. But I'm sort of imagining what it would feel like to be a 15-year-old person moving away, moving like an enormous body of water away. And the sort of, I don't want to call it like homesickness, but the longing, the felt difference between the lack of family. And I've been in somewhat similar situations myself, not quite so young. And in those cases, home starts to become almost like a kind of mythical place, like, or the fantasies that you have, again, I might be projecting this on you, can potentially sort of bleed into the reality that's slipping away the longer you spend, sort of away from one's homeland. And I guess I wonder too about how that feeds the work. I mean, I introduced it as a space of the future, but of course it's also a space of the past.
Mm-hmm. Well, before I even get in there, I think that sort of distinction in time is something I think about a lot, because whenever we talk about the future, we're really trying to talk about the present. And so it placing past, future, and present together feels very natural to me. And I do think, going back to your question, that for me, in a sense, all the world building that I do in my work is a way of trying to build some home for myself, because I feel like the moment I left Puerto Rico was the moment that I had no home. You know, the place I'm in right now, I've lived in for, you know, this place 1 year, the whole building 10 years. Like, it's been forever, but it just doesn't, that sort of grounding feeling, and I mean, I love my place, but I mean, like, the grounding feeling of home has kind of eluded me for longer than I even was in Puerto Rico, because I've been here for longer than 15 years. And so I find that it has gathered a kind of mythical quality, and home no longer, even when I'm sort of reflecting on Puerto Rico and when I go back home, no longer even means the four walls that I grew up within. It's actually the texture of this landscape that's so important to me. It's the balmy sea air on a summer night, and that feeling of breathing that air and feeling that I could be 1,000 years ago, I could be now. That is actually kind of the grounding feeling of home. And I feel like that I now am kind of able to tap into here or in other places that I've been at for a long term, not in the sort of traditional kind of like architecturally prescribed idea of a house and a home, but rather the natural world itself. And that, I think, is why the language of the world, of the natural world, which is sort of a problematic term, but you know what I mean, is so key to the work, because I find that a lot of the times, whether it's in the more fantastical work or the work that's still grounded in research, that's where me as the narrator or the characters or whatever, that's where they find some sort of rooting in these sort of shorelines or forests, and that's why, in a sense, talking about climate becomes really important, because in a way I can't afford to lose home again.
And I've heard you in this conversation a few times refer to world building, and I'm wondering if you could like build that out a little bit in relationship to science fiction. And I mention that because in our emails back and forth before this, I was like, I don't want to just frame it around science fiction. And you were sort of like, oh, thank God. You know, that seems like the really kind of obvious place to go, or like least imaginative. I'm getting some echo back. Are you all getting echo back of my own voice?
Yeah, I'm gonna stop my
I'm gonna just stop my video. See if that's better.
Yeah, I think that's
okay. There may be some echo, but I'll proceed. And I had to agree. I mean, of course, there are ideas within the framework of science fiction and feminist science fiction that make sense, like the conjoining of theory and practice, you know, the liberatory imagination. But I guess I'm wondering if you can point to why you yourself are not necessarily describing your work in terms of science fiction and more in terms of world building. Like, what is the distinction there for you?
I mean, I was excited to not frame it as sci-fi, because I feel like that's often where the conversation lands and denies a lot of the weirder, I think, avenues that I've kind of carved into the work. But I'm not hesitant to call it sci-fi either, because I do think that in the best of times, the work, especially the earlier work, is directly indebted to your Ursula K. Le Guin's or Sam Delaney or Octavia Butler or James Tiptree, right? These sort of important queer and feminist authors, some of color, who are engaging in the same project of, using the future as a place to consider liberation, and not just consider liberation, but, and this is where world building becomes important, architect liberation, actually build it into the story of what will be. And so that's why I use this term world building, which I do borrow from speculative fiction, right? So world building, to me, is all of the behind the scenes work you do to make a universe credible. And that for me is really key, right? So in a very reductive sense, right? It's like I made a map, and then I made the language that the people use in this future, and then I made a I don't know, some sort of document of what beasts you might encounter here, etc. Right? So I'm talking in a very kind of dorky sci-fi realm there, but it's the details that make the world that maybe the audience doesn't see or the reader doesn't read, but without which it's not credible. And that is really, really important, because I think any good work of science fiction needs to feel not credible by the rules of our moment. That's in fact the opposite of the opposite project it's engaged in. It needs to be, and I feel like that's kind of one of my biggest tasks as an artist working within that sort of genre, because otherwise, if I can't make the world credible, then how can I make the liberation that's after credible?
I have maybe, based on my timing, I have space for one more question. Jay, you can tell me if I'm wrong about that. So I'm gonna kind of wedge it in here.
That sounds good.
Okay, thanks. Maybe this is reiterative, but in reading science fiction myself, and maybe this is too self-evident, but I'm amazed by the force of imagination, right? Like, how does, how does Marge like imagine this, right? Like that feels like the engine is the power of imagination. And I mean, I'm like hedging a little bit because I think this is a bit of an impossible question, but how do you see the force of imagination in your work in terms of building a new world? Because yes, we're talking about the present. Yes, we're talking about the past, but there's also a kind of limitlessness, right, in what you could make be. And so maybe we can end on this question of imagination. Like, how do you utilize it? Like, what are the rules?
I mean, I think you really nailed it in terms of it's not just, wow, look at this wild imagining. It's that in itself, within a wild imagining is contained the permission for any of us to engage in that kind of thinking. Ursula K. Le Guin specifically talks about the power of imagination and how it's sort of relegated to the realm of children in the way that we think about it and the way that we kind of discuss it, because it can't directly be monetized, right? So there's no use value to it, so we discard it. But within the same essay, right, she sort of goes on to talk about imagination as an important tool to the dismantling of capitalism, right? The imagination was key to moving beyond the divine right of kings. And, she beautifully says that if we can imagine, that at one point that was unimaginable. And once it became imaginable, it became actionable. And so I think imagination beyond the practice, right, beyond the process of imagining that I use, holds hopefully this power where somebody engaging a work that is incredibly far out in its imagining of our species, of our future, of everything, doesn't just stop there. It allows an audience, and I'm not saying this specifically about my work, but any sort of great work of imagination, it allows the audience, it allows the people in front of that work to hopefully give themselves permission to imagine otherwise. And I think that that's kind of the big dilemma. I think that we have, it's not even about giving ourselves permission. That permission has been taken away from us, and it's sort of been, imagination is sort of tossed aside as frivol. And I actually think that it is absolutely imperative and perhaps the seed to liberation.
I couldn't agree more. All right, I'm guessing we're at time, so I'll end the questioning there. But I want to thank you, Sofia, for just being such an incredible point of sort of creative and political, a kind of a North Star for me across these 12 years that we've been friends. So thank you, and thank you for having me here.
Oh my God, I can't even. You're the best. I love you, and thanks everyone for hearing us.
Thank you both. Thank you both. That was terrific. I'm going to go ahead and introduce Bassem and Zach, our next guests here. Bassem Saad is an artist and writer from Beirut, trained in architecture. His practice deals with future visualization and simulation and objects or operations that distribute violence, pleasure, care, and waste. He attempts to locate space and time for toying and maneuvering within complex governance systems through video, text, spatial installation, and virtual environments. Bassem is here with Zach. Zach Blas is an artist, filmmaker, writer, and lecturer in the Department of Visual Cultures at Goldsmiths, University of London. His practice spans moving image, computational theory, performance, and science fiction, and he's also an Eyebeam alum. Welcome to you both.
Hello. Hi, everyone.
Awesome. Do you want to start?
Sure. I'll do the description for visual impairment. So I have long black hair and it's tied back, and I'm wearing a blue shirt in front of a brown background. And so, yeah, my name is Betsam Saad. I've been in New York since January, and before that, I was living in Beirut for my entire life. I studied architecture, and that influences my practice. And as Jay said, I'm interested in objects or systems that distribute violence, care, waste, and pleasure. And yeah, I've been mainly working in video and installation, and I came to Eyebeam with the intention of focusing on a performance project, but I've been mainly doing writing because just like the way things have been, I don't feel like I can delve into a new medium, or I haven't even really been thinking in terms of my art practice that I usually do. But it's been a good time to just focus on some writing. And yeah, should we?
Yeah, how about I describe myself?
Yes, please.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I am a 38-year-old queer man wearing a black t-shirt. I have white skin, the product of a Puerto Rican father and a white Appalachian mother. I have a beard that I haven't shaved in, I think, 18 years. I'm wearing glasses, and I have on a black hat. Bassem, I'm so happy that we get to share this time together, and I think it's interesting to point out that we would have met in, I think, in October. Bassem and I would have met in Beirut, but that was prevented from happening given the uprisings that were spurned at the time there. And we, I'm so happy to be able to share this time with you. I haven't known Bassem that long, but we've been corresponding over the last month. I've had the chance to read some of his very beautiful, but also quite fierce writing. And we share some intersecting points. We're both queer artists. We both primarily live outside of the US. And we have both in our own ways worked with the idea of refusal. And I wanted to start by just giving you the opportunity to talk about refusal, since the residency was organized around this idea of terms of refusal, how refusal is operative in your practice and your writing, or how you've been developing it since you've been in New York, and maybe how you think about that, how you think about refusal as a queer artist in particular.
Thank you, Zach, for the lovely introduction. It is really interesting to think that we would have met in Beirut if things hadn't gone the way, if this wasn't this like series of huge events that have been just taking place since last year, for me at least. And so when I think when I applied to Eyebeam last year, I was still in Beirut, and I was working around the idea of, like, I was working beginning from the waste crisis in Lebanon and Beirut. And I was thinking of just like what it means to inhabit an environment that is filled with waste, or that is filled with different kinds of toxicities. And I was also still thinking of the idea of refusal in terms of political refusal, in terms of protest and rioting. Because back then we had some small rioting in 2015. So we had like a kind of a small failed uprising. And I had no idea of knowing back then that at the end of the year, we would be looking at a massive nationwide uprising. And so when I applied, I did spin that term, like I said waste refusal and also political refusal. But to really to go back to where I was last year when I applied, I never would have imagined that we would have had an uprising in Beirut, a major pandemic, and then what is now being called the Black Spring in the United States. And to think on all these just massive scale events in the past few months is just really kind of overwhelming. And I've been just trying to navigate my place within Beirut and also what I can contribute here. And it is sometimes you kind of have to pause and kind of prioritize participating in events around you that that are not you doing your work necessarily, or are not you resuming your artistic practice in a traditional sense. And I think I've been thinking a lot of that in terms of refusal and several meanings, trash and also rioting.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's a good opportunity for us to talk about this video that you've made. Maybe you want to pull up, whenever you want, you can pull up images of that work. Bassam made a video before the Eyebeam residency. And maybe, I think that could be an interesting place for us to start, called Kink Retrograde, which explores what you call risk-aware consensual kink contracts. You've also written on this idea. So I guess what I think could be interesting to extract from that and think about around this idea, or around, thinking about queer refusal, could be the way that perversion works for you in this work, maybe queer perversion, and then also your critique of resilience.
Yeah, thank you.
I mean, maybe that's what you could start with perversion. Maybe that's your place.
So I made this video. These are some stills from Kink Retrograde. I'll flip through them. But basically the idea was that, so I filmed this video inside a landfill, inside one of the newer landfills that had opened up around Beirut, that were directly next to the sea and dumping waste directly into the sea. And contaminating the surrounding areas. But the idea was that I was using that physical space to kind of I was using it as a backdrop for this fictional grouping of people who decide to take on, to start something new, or kind of start a new way of organizing themselves. And that I was just jokingly calling kink. And the way I was thinking of it is that I felt like a really honest and transparent way of engaging with a very toxic, violent, brutal landscape and government also, is to just kind of not pretend that the violence doesn't exist there, or not to pretend that our relationship to government doesn't involve a kind of violence, but to say that what if we were able to consent or refuse that violence, which is basically what contracts of kink have, real world contracts of kink. When people decide there's a form of kink that includes written contracts, and people kind of sign on to it, and there are terms like a safe word and what realm they're willing to negotiate in terms of that risky activity. So I was thinking, like, what if we could organize with each other and basically confront the state on these new terms? Like, what if we were able to set those terms? And back then, I didn't know what that meant. Like, I was just thinking, I definitely meant protest, but I didn't think that, like, right after I finished editing, we would be actually on the street for like several months. So beginning in October till around January, it was purely time spent on the street protesting. And we started joking at some point, like, about tear gas. So we started saying that, we started like me and just my friends were always protesting. We would say, like, oh, like, I kind of miss the tear gas. Like, I want some more of that. Not to make light of the dangers that exist when you're protesting, but it was kind of a weird time when obviously there was a lot of police brutality in Beirut, but one, it's really nothing compared to the US. Like, it's not comparable to what the NYPD, for example, does to protesters. But we were also just like joking about it because one way of accepting that is just to make light of what your life has become. So we were like, what if tear gas is addictive in itself, and you just like start to enjoy wanting to go into tear gas or something, which is really silly and like definitely can't be compared to what we've been seeing now in the US.
Yeah, well,
I think.
I mean, maybe you could talk about how that manifests a little bit in the video, because maybe we could talk about some kind of practical elements. There is text, there is dance, and I think that first scene, or the first still that we saw, right, is someone filling up a douche nozzle, correct? Yeah. Yeah, I guess I'm interested in that. That kind of relation, that these kind of performative elements in the work, to dance, this kind of act with the douche, and how that ends up. Yeah, or I guess how you see that relationship to things like political action and political protest and uprising, because I can tell so much with the writing as well that they're so deeply entwined with your practice. So do you see the videos as rehearsals, as kind of conceptual experiments, as speculations?
Yeah, I think they're definitely, like, there is some speculation in there. And in the film, like, we see this character who's my very dear friend, Rayan Abdel Khalid, who's an amazing DJ called DJ Mawadda. And I want to give a nod to them. So I asked them to be my main star for the film. And what we did is we filmed inside the landfill, and we kept getting kicked out of the landfill because it was illegal for us to film there. So for me, even that was kind of like some kind of protest. And then what happened was, throughout the film, we see Rayan like do these different gestures with the landscape, like with dirt and with the water and with like, and they're mainly alone throughout until the end. But they're just alone doing these kind of gestures that look like self-care. So it looks like they're meditating at some point, or they're doing this kind of yoga practice, but it's like in this environment that's very toxic. And here, like, they're filling up an enema with toxic water. And then towards the end, they decide that they should be doing this maybe, but not doing it alone. So they're joined by my two other friends, Jessica Khazri and Veda Colleri, who towards the end, they just like kind of stand in front of the waste and they start practicing this weird line dance. So that was definitely like a metaphor for some kind of protest, or some kind of maybe like holding each other and organizing, and like some kind of any kind of horizontal organizing that acknowledges that we're in a very dangerous and risky situation, but this needs to be done, and we're like kind of holding hands towards something, or like supporting each other towards something better. And yeah, that's how I was thinking of the gesture. So the performance was like all kind of this metaphor for refusing to do this individually and refusing to continue to live this isolated life and practice, but to just decide to be within, to go into the risk, but with a community.
Mm-hmm. Okay, in the interest of time, I'm also going to divert to a different topic, because as you know, there are certain points I'd like for us to be able to hit on. But I do think this relates to everything we've been building on. And I think, your practice so robustly is, building sets of concepts, design, videos, visual material that's definitely in relationships, that's in the relationship to the, political conditions that we're living within. So you have this background in architecture and design, and another concept, an idea that you've been developing and writing is this ideal of a betrayal of the design profession, as you call it, right? Betraying the profession. And this is certainly another way to think about refusal. And it would be great if you could kind of introduce this idea of betraying the refusal. And I also thought, if you feel like it, since this is kind of a critique of design, maybe more broadly existing in even creative industries, I was curious to hear about you reflect on this in relationship to being a resident at Eyebeam, which is a place that supports art, design, technology, and just kind of thinking about what it means to be doing this kind of critical work within this particular institution. And, I asked that also in the spirit of having been a resident myself at Eyebeam, I think in 2013, when the institution had a very different political valence. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, about betrayal. So I was just writing, like you read it, I'm writing this piece now, like, because I studied architecture and I kind of refuse to continue to practice it, not because, like, that's definitely in some way, it's not privileged because I have the material means for it, but it's privileged because I just decided that I want to do something else. But what I was writing a piece about betrayal, and I said that, like, okay, we shouldn't leave our professions, but there should be a way where we don't think of ourselves all the time as professional people doing their respective jobs. Like, one thing with architects that they do a lot is that they, like, organize as architects, that they, like, identify as architects all the time. Also artists, I think. So what I was trying to say is that what if we didn't think of ourselves primarily as architects, artists, designers, technologists, but what if we just thought of ourselves as workers, and we thought of like our material interests and the material interests of other workers? That was kind of the gist of it. But the idea of betrayal, I kind of borrowed from the decolonial Algerian French writer, Houria Boutelja, who says that she has a book called Whites, Jews, and Us. And she praises Jean Genet, who's the French, white European filmmaker and writer. And she says that she praises him because she says he betrays his race. So he betrays a dominant kind of, a dominant category, and decides not to align with that category, but to align himself with, like, the back then the struggles were, like, for the liberation of Algeria, with different struggles happening in the colonies of France. So in a way, like, which is what we discuss often towards people who are, like, in a dominant, let's say in a dominant race or gender or class. Like, the idea is not to be benevolent to others in kind of like more oppressed positions. The idea is not to do charity, but to kind of, like, see that liberation as also your own liberation. And we could think of that now in relation to the Black struggle in the US. It's not to, like, be, like, as different people of color or as white people, not to, like, think of, like, being benevolent to that cause, but to think of that liberation as automatically kind of also ensuring everyone else's liberation, which is, yeah, like how I was thinking of betrayal. And in the context of Eyebeam, I think what's interesting is that I was talking about it in the article. I also talk about technocracy, or, like, thinking of, like, technological advancement, or, like, technology can solve specific problems, which is of course great and necessary. But the idea is that technocracy often ends up, like, obscuring more than it really, like, it ends up just, like, hiding a lot of the class and race and gender dynamics behind itself, rather than really, like, allowing for their acknowledgement. so I was thinking like betrayal in terms of I-beam is also like betraying a medium or betraying like a specific technique, and not always continuing to think as people who are creative technologists, but also to think of people who are just citizens or people who are engaged in something outside of their own practice. So that's kind of how I think of these things. And yeah, like we've reflected, I think, on both our experiences at I-beam, and I think what's so interesting about my fellow cohort this year, who I love dearly, is that we're all kind of like committed to certain things, like certain political commitments, and then we use technology to follow those commitments, rather than like investing first in the technology and then finding the politics behind it.
Yeah, I think I mean, I don't think this will surprise or upset Roddy when I say this, but I think, you know, when I was there, it did certainly feel like one had to betray the institution to a degree to maybe explore work that had primarily political motivations or queer or feminist. But, you know, I like this idea of betrayal that you've developed, because I do think I mean, you've written this lovely article that thinks about it so particularly within design, but I do think it translates, you know, to the arts broadly, or even to academia. You know, I'm a full-time professor at a university, and I think this is something a lot of us do try to think about. You know, the one way you put betrayal is rejection of the rule of the experts. And I think there's two tiers of experts at universities. You have, you know, maybe in a bureaucratic sense, you have tenured professors, and then you have administration. And you're trying to kind of find those spaces to imagine an education otherwise is possible, but extremely challenging. Okay, I know we're running out of time, so I wanted to give you, okay, maybe I'll say both of my questions, my final questions, and you can pick which one you want to engage with. One was just about writing. You know, you're an artist that writes, and I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about that, reflect that. What is the relationship of writing, of developing concepts, and how do you see that kind of sitting within your visual practice? Do you think of them as something separate? Do you see the practice as something all kind of contained and together? Okay, that's one question. Maybe you can also just cram both of these together. I mean, the other question or comment that I wanted to end with was, you know, something that we share in common is not living in the US, although we're both in the US right now. So I've lived and worked in London for 5 years, but I got stuck in the US when the coronavirus broke out. And right, you're here on your residency. So I thought it's an opportunity to just think and talk about working and being embedded in the conditions of the US right now, of today. So basically conditions of the US or your writing practice, or some combination of both.
Yeah, I think with writing, I usually I'll spend a lot of time researching and also reflecting on my own life and engagements and all of that, and in preparation for, let's say, a new artistic work. And I will end up kind of forming these observations, or even sometimes just like diaristic writing that I feel like relates to specific concepts that I'm thinking through or ideas that I'm thinking through. And sometimes when the opportunity comes up, I'll try to write, or just like to try to publish or write something in parallel to what I'm thinking of. Because I do feel that sometimes writing like circulates in a way that artistic work doesn't. I mean, they circulate differently, but sometimes sometimes I feel like I just want to kind of let go of the medium and just communicate purely with language and like get some kind of feedback or have a conversation. So I feel like writing in some way does that. And this is what mostly I've been doing throughout these months, just because it's been like the most convenient to do. And in terms of being in the US, I feel like I'm really honored to be here when the Black Lives Matter movement is taking place in the way that it is right now. And again, it's just to like the sequence of the past few months, which has been like uprising, virus, uprising, is just fascinating. And yeah, like I've been kind of dumbfounded. Like I've been just taking a step back, not able to continue business as usual since October. I don't know when that will end, or even if it should end, you know. But yeah, I feel like it's such a weird time. I'm hoping things continue to just like tremor, like in some kind of, like the earthquake, I hope it just continues in some way.
And I think we should continue writing.
Huh?
Continue your writing.
I feel that's the only thing I can do right now. But yeah, and so that's how I relate to those two things. So they are kind of entwined. Like being in the US, I haven't been able to do the things I usually do. I'm not as fearless to go shoot anywhere I want to shoot. I don't feel like I can just like pull everything around. So I've just been doing some writing in quarantine. And
yeah, well, I think what strikes me about your practice is this an attention and a thoughtfulness towards working in conditions. That's really what I've taken away from engaging with your writing and your work over the past month. And yeah, it's been a delight and a pleasure. But I want to check in with Jay. I think we're probably at time. Is that correct?
Yeah, you're coming up on time.
Okay.
Maybe we can transition and bring Carmen and Sofia back up, and we can sort of talk with the four of you with the audience. Awesome. Sofia, you here with us? I know Carmen had to dash out for a second.
No, I'm here. I made an arrangement.
Amazing. Bassem, can we post your article up?
it is still a draft, but
Can you just share that draft? You don't have to. I mean, whatever you're comfortable with.
I could.
Yeah.
Definitely to you, Elissa.
Yeah. We will share it once. Eyebeam will share it once it's complete. And
okay, cool.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you so much, everybody, for diving into those conversations, those rich conversations with one another. A lot to think about. I know one comment was thinking about artists' response to major global issues right now. And colonialism, global warming, which I know you both have referenced, and how artists are responding. So if you maybe have thoughts in relationship to your artistic practices, or I know, Bassem, you've been doing a lot of organizing and stuff right now, and or connected to those communities. So any reflections from that perspective? Somebody's waving. Go ahead.
I think I wish I could do more organizing. I wish I could help more in terms of actually doing organizing. Just been trying to like attend and be present and go to protests. Back in Beirut, I definitely felt like I could be more involved. Like here, there's a fear of even stepping out on the street because of my citizenship status when a protest is going on. But yeah, I feel like that really takes up a lot. Like it just completely takes up a lot of energy because you just want to follow up. You want to know what's going on. Like when there's something going on, I almost can't work unless I have a deadline. And yeah, I just end up being on Twitter all the time.
Yeah. Another question coming from Manga, and thank you very much, Maddie. Maddie with the quick share just shared your video in the chat box.
Not the full video, but if you message me, I can definitely send you. I can send you a link. Like if you email me and any email that you see on you can email me through my address on the website, and I can definitely send you a link.
Thanks, Bassem. And then we have a comment here from Mahan. A scene from Bassem's work, Beside the Sea, reminded me of the last scene of Zach's Jubilee 2033. And these works both comment on the role of the corporate world in what's happening at the world at large. Zach brought this up in his relation to Bassem's relationship to the institution, but I wanted to ask you both to speak a little bit about the kind of relationship you can imagine between artists working with tech and the tech industry that is politically viable and progressive right now?
Tough question, Mahan. I don't know. I think we've talked about this with Tayoun actually in our residency, and I feel like all the residents can speak to this. I'd love to hear from Sofia also about like how we feel like we can navigate collaborations with the tech world. Or with big tech institutions. I'm not sure how to do that. There's always room. I feel like you kind of always need to weigh like the level, like, because everything, we're complicit all the time, we're complicit in everything. So I feel like you can just like always weigh the level of complicity versus what you think there's some kind of material like give back, or whatever you can think you can gain towards progressive ideas.
Yeah, well, it's yeah. I mean, just to speak, if we're not addressing the ends of our films, then the question about working with the tech industry or people in tech, that's been, I would say, really slow and trial and error for me. And I've done some projects. Actually, a project that I made in New York in 2019, where I think there were more straight men on the team, the production team from the tech world that I would have liked, which caused almost a catastrophic failure of this work. And I think, as I develop work, I just try and bring more and more attention to actually just building like a long-term team of people that I share some kind of political alliances with. I'm someone that I was trained as a film director originally, and that I like to build teams and make work that way. So actually, because of Mahan, I got introduced to a queer machine learning engineer in London, who's someone that I've started working with. But I don't know, I guess the answer is just you tread carefully and thoughtfully. But for me, it's like I do really like working with people in tech, because I work at Goldsmiths, and like I can't even get the university to give me a new table. So getting access to some kind of emerging technology can be like a major challenge at my university. So by reaching out to people in tech is one way for me to kind of get hands-on experience with some new technology. So yeah, I do try and do it, definitely.
Thank you.
I think two things. I think something that really resonated with what Bassem was just discussing was that a really powerful kind of connective tissue in our residency, in our cohort, was this idea that we were embedded in this sort of art and technology residency, but every one of us, I would say unequivocally it's not up on our resume that we're not coding, we're not writing code. We access technology as it serves our ideas and as it serves the work. And that's 100% how I feel about it as a resource. I will, for me, make the distinction between like people who create sort of technological structures, whether in the sort of soft sense or the hard sense, and the tech industry, which I personally won't abide and won't. I'm not interested in like a Facebook residency. I'm not interested in that, because I feel like it becomes, at the end of the day, another way where another institution is co-opting something that I've worked really hard at making with a lot of tender love and care for the people that it's meant for. And I can't let that be used in the service of something that is otherwise imploding the world that we live in. And I can't. But I do want to make the distinction there with the people that are using these technologies in ways that are creative and radical, because I think that is an incredibly important and valuable part of where we're going. And I will also sort of couch that in saying that, like, I'm currently like on a social media detox, and I never was on Twitter as much as other people. So I do know anecdotally how important these networks are, especially when it comes to organizing, and especially when it comes to sort of like the living, breathing moment. But I, even in that, remain skeptical because I do feel like there, you know, who's behind the wall? But again, even that, I'm using like hard world metaphors for something that exists in the fluffy cloud. Yeah.
I got a question from Anamika. Bassem, you spoke about how people frequently organize around their professions rather than actual labor. Can you elaborate on this structure, these structures of participation within an uprising and its shortcomings, or rather the strengths of removing professional delineations?
I think as we've seen, like in a lot of the uprisings recently, is that one, there's, I mean, or like, I think in Beirut, we were trying to learn from the Sudanese uprising, where basically after a period of initial revolt that's very kind of like chaotic and just crosses all bounds, there starts to be like this organizing based on trade. So at some point, like new unions start to form, or like you start to find out how through the profession you can contribute to something larger. But I'm just like, when I say that, I mean like, I just think that doesn't necessarily need to be all the time how we organize. Or like, sure, unions are necessary, but just like the more a union can encompass, the stronger it can be. Or yeah, or not to always just like identify as a professional, but just to like think of how it intersects with other struggles.
I know that many of you work with collaborators. I know, Sofia, you work with performers in your work, sometimes multiple performers. I'm interested in how you all build trust in your collaborative practices, especially with people you haven't worked with yet before.
Yeah, that's, at least for me, it's a process that begins long before even the work is set to begin, because I do feel that, and this is something that's kind of come up across both of our talks, like we are still working within a labor environment, and I am still working with people that I'm asking to come along with me on something that is work. And that work doesn't always take the shape of time and energy, but it certainly takes the shape of thought before and after. Again, a lot of the themes that I am inviting people to kind of react to, et cetera, are not themes that are easy, and there are themes that are quite traumatic actually for a lot of us. And so generally the way it works is I deliberately lay out a map of the work that is very soft, with lots and lots of plot holes, lots and lots of open avenues. And then I hand that over to prospective collaborators so that they can respond to it. And a lot of the times that response doesn't come in the way of like, oh, here, I wrote myself a part. It actually comes in, well, this made me think of this, or I think the costuming should be this, to react to that. And I think that sort of collaborative work, while from like a practice perspective is harder to organize and harness, is the only way in that aspect of the work that I can feel that we're sort of approaching the semblance of being equitable within the work. And I say that because I'm still always the director, and that's something that, as you probably gathered from this talk, I'm always wrestling with. But people also that are working with me want direction. So there is this sort of push and pull that often happens around these themes. But I will say that if the project that I'm engaging in across all of these works is the project of imagining a plural future, then it cannot be built materially just by me. It just can't. So that's why it's really important that I invite folks to come on board. Most of the time, they're professionals and experts at something that I know nothing about. So there's also this very kind of humbling period where I'm having to learn a new language. And I find that putting myself in these situations where I'm sort of vulnerable myself, hopefully, I think, again, start to level the field as much as, again, it's possible within this kind of project structure.
Thank you.
In terms of trust, I think I kind of like once I would try to work with friends, like whenever I know someone closely enough, I try to work with them, but still making sure to find like space within the budget to compensate them properly, and like even more if I can. But yeah, I feel like what I want to play around with is just like maybe playing with, or like contacting, let's say, people within community organizations or activist groups, and then try to just like pay them as much as I can of the budget and have them do something small or something. I feel like that's like an interesting way of thinking through art practice, but I don't know how much that's possible always, but yeah.
Thanks. Other questions from the group or the other residents in the room? Not to put you all on the spot, Elissa and Pelenakeke. I know one of the questions that, and then maybe, after we talk through this one, if there aren't any more questions, we can wrap up. One of the things that I found was really fascinating in our preparation for this conversation in the lead up was the question of what we're all ingesting right now and how that's kind of affecting what we're making and our lives, media, news articles, and I just think that that's such an interesting question. So if any of you want to speak to, in the last 3 months, what you're taking in.
Sofia, do you want to do this first?
No. No, I'm kidding. I will admit that I had zero focus for, I want to say, 2.5 months of the 3 months that I have been in whatever we're in anymore. So I say that my attention's been so drifty and scattered. But I will say that one thing I'm really excited about, which is kind of come because of the everything kind of falling apart in terms of the work and in terms of even this residency and producing new work, is that I've had to kind of force myself to revisit the work that I was scripting and choreographing for Eyebeam. And that work very quickly was sort of in this position of asking whether or not revolution was possible and what shape that looked like in the Americas in like a short-term future. And here we are. And so it's kind of become this very delightful, anxiety-inducing experience of having to recalibrate the whole thing. And so I have, again, I kind of really reeled back, and I'm going back to sort of, for me, some of the basics, but I'm reading this really important book in Puerto Rican sort of theory history called El País de Cuatro Pisos, The Country in Four Stories. And it's sort of a radical retelling of the history of Puerto Rico, where it operates on this idea of the country being 4 stories. And the first story being slaves that were brought into the island. And that at that point, the Tainos were eradicated almost completely. So it was this complete mestizo society, and how in our telling of ourselves of this history now, we completely delete that floor. And we go straight to the second floor, which we think of as being this kind of land owning kind of light-skinned gentry, when really those were immigrants from Spain, even as late as 1815, again, erasing that first floor. And I think a lot of the work that I'm involved in is sort of, in every sense, going back to the first floor, both practically and in my research.
Wow, thank you.
Yeah, for me, I think, and I've been trying to kind of like still keep track of my of the things I really care about in Beirut while being here, but also try to in parallel while existing here. So I feel like right now, what I think is the equivalent of the 4th floor in Lebanon is people who are migrant workers existing in Lebanon, either from countries in Africa or in Southeast Asia. And these people are not involved, are not included within the labor law, are not, don't qualify for minimum wage. Like in terms of like domestic work, people are, it's just like, it's a whole field of like struggle, which is the kafala system, which is the sponsorship system for bringing in basically not just domestic workers, but also construction workers. And so yeah, like that is, and I was just like, for me, I try to work with organizations there, and I've been posting links to like a fundraiser for people from the kafala system, so I could paste it here if anyone feels like donating to something they care about. And yeah, like there is always, if there isn't, I feel like if in a country there isn't an indigenous population or people from other places, descended from other places, like as like the African American population in the US, there's always a migrant labor population that is excluded from any kind of regulation, and that would be like what you're saying is the fourth floor.
Yeah, thank you. We have a question here from Julia. I'm curious about the role of editing for video projects, how that becomes part of the world building, and at the same time, separation between the performance, world building, and conversations.
That's a really good question. For me, and I say that because editing, it's a good question that targets something that in the process chain is so tedious. I actually hate when the project, the least exciting part is when I get to the edit, because the performance is done, the sort of improvisatory quality of being in front of a camera is gone. You're kind of now in a very rigorous space. And at the same time, that's the point where you actually get to tie strange things together. And it actually becomes a really important narrative tool, not just in the obvious sense of sequencing, but in the setting of a texture or a feeling that is one of the harder things to kind of communicate. I will also say that it really is important for me in delineating performance and performance that's mediated by a camera or performance that exists just for the camera. Because for me, if I record a performance and then edit it, it's not documentation. And in fact, I work really hard to have these two things exist discreetly. I don't really like to have just documentation of a performance. It has to have a reason for being. So it actually, as much as I find it a tedious part of the work, I actually have to think about it before I even start performing or asking folks to perform with me, because if editing is going to become an important part of it, then it's immediately going to affect what the live event is. On the opposite end, if an event is sort of determined as having liveness be part of its kind of primary language, then the edit, beyond not even being that consequential, might become, as a result of the live event, like not even going to happen, because I decide that it doesn't need to exist as video, because I also believe part of the magic of performance is rewarding the bodies in the room. And there's something that happens in live performance that we can all agree doesn't really translate through the screen.
Thank you. Maybe we have time for one more question, and if not, we can wrap up. I know Carmen had to run. She says thank you. Thank you so much, everybody. I think this has been a terrific opportunity to connect and to share so much about your practices and your relationships to each other. And I deeply appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. And we'll be doing the same thing tomorrow at 5 o'clock with Pelenakeke Brown and Elissa Moorehead and their guests, Tina Campt and Jeff Casper. I want to thank Zach, Bassem, Carmen, and Sofia, and everyone helping out in the Eyebeam team today, and everyone that joined us. And I hope you have a good rest of your evenings. And tomorrow will be lit, Bassem says. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a great night. Thank you.